The saw hit my fence at 6:14 a.m. and sent orange sparks across the wet grass. A man in an HOA polo leaned his shoulder into the cut while Victoria Hale stood beside him and said, "Take the whole line down." Cedar splinters sprayed across my driveway, and the gate my father and I had hung by hand dropped hard enough to shake the porch rail. Behind her, 6 backyards sat open to the drainage corridor my fence was built to protect, and one more cut would expose the only marked setback tied to the county runoff permit under half this subdivision. She was not just tearing down my fence. She was cutting into a line her board did not control. The smell of burnt metal and fresh sap mixed in the cool morning air. My coffee went bitter in my mouth. Victoria stepped over the fallen post in white heels that should have sunk into the mud and tapped her clipboard like she was calling a meeting to order. "This structure violates community standards," she said. "You were warned." I looked past her at the contractor's truck. No permit tag in the windshield. No city decal. No barricades. They had come early for a reason. Another worker hooked a chain to my gate and dragged it sideways through the gravel, leaving a crooked scar from the road to my garage. That gate kept deer out of my garden, delivery vans off my septic field, and strangers away from the easement markers near the ditch. Victoria knew that. She had seen the survey flags 2 days earlier. She cut around them anyway. Then she raised one manicured finger and pointed at the back corner of my lot. "Take that section next," she said. "I want the whole barrier gone before school traffic starts." That was the second move that changed everything. School traffic. Morning runoff. Open backyards. She wasn't talking about my property anymore. She was talking about the corridor behind it like it already belonged to her. I walked down the porch steps, slow enough to keep the mud from splashing my jeans. "You're on private land," I said. My voice came out flat. Clean. The kind of tone that makes people either back off or get reckless. Victoria chose reckless. "Not for long," she said, and smiled without warmth. The chain rattled. Again. Another post snapped. The sound echoed off the houses behind her, and curtains started moving in 3 different windows. Nobody came outside. They just watched. That told me plenty. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38, and I seal drainage and access plans for a living. I bought this lot because it sat on the edge of town, where the mornings smelled like wet dirt instead of asphalt, and the line between private property and public utility still meant something. The fence wasn't decorative. It wasn't a weekend vanity project. It marked the safe side of a drainage buffer the county had measured twice and signed once, and every homeowner behind Victoria benefited from it whether they knew it or not. She took one look at cedar boards and black steel and decided it was a style issue. That was her first mistake. Her second was sending men with saws onto ground connected to a live county file. I could see the moment she realized I wasn't reaching for my phone to beg or argue. I was counting cuts. Counting workers. Counting witnesses. The contractor finally shut the saw off, and the sudden silence felt louder than the blade. Victoria tilted her head. "If you rebuild it," she said, "we'll fine you daily until you stop." Then she handed me an envelope thick enough to matter and light enough to lie. I did not open it. Not there. Not with my gate twisted in the dirt, and my property line lying in pieces at her feet. I just looked at the ditch behind her, at the orange survey cap still sticking up through the grass, and at the board members gathering near the curb like this was some petty neighborhood spectacle. It wasn't petty anymore. And by the time Victoria understood what that fence actually marked, her whole board was already in it. I stepped past the broken gate and felt the gravel shift under my boots, each piece grinding louder than it should. The air still carried that sharp mix of burnt steel and fresh cedar, and it clung to the back of my throat like something unfinished. One of the workers dragged a section of my fence toward the curb, letting it scrape the ground the whole way. He did not look at me. That told me he knew exactly what he was doing. Victoria stood near the ditch now, one heel pressed against the edge like she was claiming it inch by inch. She glanced down at the orange survey cap and nudged it with her shoe. Not hard. Just enough to move it off center. That was her third mistake. I walked closer, slow enough to see the details. The cap had a faint scratch along the side now. Fresh. The marking was not decoration. It was a reference point tied to a drainage buffer that ran behind 6 homes, including mine. Move that point, and everything downstream starts to drift. Water does not argue. It follows the line it is given. And right now, she was trying to redraw it. A truck door slammed behind me. Another neighbor stepped out halfway, then stopped. He looked at Victoria, then back at his driveway, like he was deciding which side of this he wanted to be on. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the chain clinking as it loosened from my gate. I bent down and picked up one of the cut posts. The edge was clean. Too clean for a rush job. They had planned this. They came with the right blade, the right crew, and the right timing. Early morning. Before inspectors. Before traffic. Before anyone with authority could show up without being called. Victoria turned back toward me and folded her arms. "You should have taken the notice seriously," she said. Her voice carried just enough for the windows behind her to hear. I set the post down next to the driveway and brushed the dust from my hands. "You moved a survey marker," I said. She smiled again, smaller this time. "I adjusted a visual obstruction." That word sat wrong. Obstruction. Like the fence was the problem. Like the line itself was optional. I looked past her at the corridor behind the houses. The grass dipped slightly where the runoff path curved, a shallow channel that only mattered when it rained hard. Last spring, it had filled in under an hour. Water moved fast through here when it had somewhere to go. That fence line kept the flow from cutting across the yards and pushing into foundations. It was not obvious unless you knew where to look. I knew exactly where to look. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I did not check it. Not yet. Another worker lifted a section of panel and leaned it against the truck. He hesitated for a second, then glanced at the ditch like he was finally noticing it. That was the first time I saw doubt. Small but real. Victoria saw it too. "Keep moving," she said, sharper now. "We are finishing this today." The man nodded and turned back to the truck. The hesitation was gone, but the awareness stayed. Good. I stepped closer to the edge of the ditch and crouched down. The soil was still damp from last night. Dark. Heavy. I pressed my fingers into it and felt the give. This ground held water longer than it should. It depended on that channel staying clear. I stood up and faced Victoria again. "You are not just removing a fence," I said. "You are opening a path you cannot control." She laughed, but it came out thinner than before. "This is a neighborhood, not a flood zone." Another mini shift. She was not certain. Not fully. That was all I needed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded copy of the site map I kept on me. Not to show her. Just to feel it there. The edges were worn from use. Familiar. Reliable. She noticed the movement. Her eyes flicked down for half a second. Then back up. "Whatever that is," she said, "it does not override HOA authority." Authority. She kept using that word like it covered everything. It did not. Not here. Not on this line. I looked at the houses behind her again. 6 roofs. 6 yards. 6 foundations sitting just above a system they had never thought about. Until now. The wind picked up slightly and carried a faint smell of rain from somewhere far off. Not today. But soon. And when it came, it would not care about her clipboard or her notices or her timing. It would follow the path that was left. Or the one that was broken. I slipped the map back into my pocket and stepped away from the ditch. This was already past a warning. It was past a disagreement. She had crossed into something that would not stay contained to my property. And she still thought this ended with a fine. It did not. Not even close. Victoria did not leave. That was the first thing that told me she believed she was in control. Most people push, then stepped back to see what breaks. She stayed planted at the edge of that ditch like she had already claimed the outcome. One of the board members walked up beside her, a man in a pressed shirt who kept adjusting his watch like time might fix this for him. He leaned in and said something low. I did not hear the words, but I saw Victoria's jaw tighten for half a second. Then she straightened and nodded toward my yard again. Finish the line, she said. The crew moved faster after that. Not rushed. Just committed. Another section came down, and the open space widened enough to see straight through 3 backyards to the next street over. That gap changed the way the land looked. It felt wrong. Like something that had been held in place was suddenly loose. I walked along the broken line, counting the remaining posts. 6 left. Each one marked a point that tied back to the same boundary. Each one now exposed. My phone buzzed again. This time I pulled it out. A single message from a number I knew well. County office. Just 3 words. Rain advisory issued. I looked up at the sky. Still clear. Pale blue with a thin layer of high clouds moving in from the west. The kind that shows up hours before anything actually hits. That was the 4th shift. Timing. Not immediate. But close enough to matter. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped toward the truck. The driver watched me approach, his hand resting on the door like he was ready to leave if this turned into something he did not want to explain later. You got a permit for this? I asked. Simple question. Direct. He did not answer right away. His eyes flicked to Victoria. She did not look at him. That was his answer. We were hired to remove a violation, he said finally. The words sounded practiced. Safe. I nodded once and stepped back. He was not the one making decisions. He was just following a line someone else had drawn. That line was about to move. Victoria turned toward me again, her patience thinning. You can keep asking questions, she said, or you can start fixing what you broke. I almost smiled at that. The wording. The assumption. She still believed the fence was the problem. Not the ground it marked. Not the system behind it. Just the boards and posts in front of her. Another worker lifted the last intact section near the ditch and hesitated again. He looked down into the shallow channel, then back at the house behind him. A small house. Light gray siding. The back door opened, and a woman stepped out, holding a phone to her ear. She stopped when she saw the gap. Her eyes moved from the ditch to the broken fence to Victoria. No words. Just recognition. That was the moment the impact moved beyond me. I felt it shift. This was no longer just my property being altered. It was the structure behind 6 homes being opened without understanding what it carried. The worker set the panel down more carefully this time. Not gentle. Just aware. Victoria noticed the hesitation and snapped her fingers once. We are not stopping halfway, she said. Get it done. Her voice carried farther now. Sharper. It hit the houses behind her and came back thinner. Less certain. I stepped closer again, stopping just short of the line where the fence had been. The ground there felt different under my boots. Softer. Less compacted. It had been protected. Guided. Now it was open. You are creating a path, I said. She exhaled through her nose, a short, controlled breath. I am restoring uniformity. Different words. Same intent. Control the appearance. Ignore the function. I looked at the board member beside her again. He was watching the ditch now, not me. His hand had stopped moving on his watch. That was the first real sign of doubt at her side. Small, but enough. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of distant rain mixed with cut wood and metal. It settled over the yard like a warning that had not reached everyone yet. I turned and walked back toward my porch, leaving the broken line behind me. Not retreating. Just changing position. I knew what came next, and it was not going to happen out here in the dirt with half a crew and a clipboard. It was going to happen where records lived. Where lines were fixed in ink, not opinion. Victoria watched me go, and I could feel it without turning around. She thought I was backing down. That I had finally understood her authority. She had not noticed what I had noticed. Not yet. And by the time she did, the line she crossed would not be one she could step back over. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, but the sound of metal scraping gravel still pushed through the walls like it belonged there now. It did not. Not in my house. Not on my land. I walked straight to the kitchen table and pulled the drawer open without looking. The folder sat exactly where I left it. Thick. Worn at the edges. Not something you grab unless you already know what it contains. I set it down and flipped it open. Pages shifted under my fingers, each one tied to a line outside that had just been broken. Not visually. Structurally. That was the difference Victoria did not understand. I picked up the map and laid it flat. The same one I had carried in my pocket, but this version was full scale. Clear. Precise. The boundary ran across my property and curved along the back of the subdivision like a quiet spine holding everything in place. I traced it once with my finger. Then again. The spot where the fence had been was marked in black ink, backed by measurements that did not change just because someone decided they did. Outside, the saw stopped. Silence followed. Not calm. Just a pause. I listened for a second longer, then reached for my phone. One call. That was all it would take to start something bigger than a neighborhood argument. I hovered over the contact, then stopped. Not yet. Timing mattered. Always did. I stepped back outside instead. The light had shifted slightly. Brighter now, but flatter. The kind of light that comes before clouds settle in. The crew had cleared the entire fence line. Nothing left but uneven ground and scattered debris pushed toward the curb. The ditch behind the houses looked wider without the barrier. Exposed. Victoria stood near the truck, talking to the board member again. This time her voice was lower. Controlled. But I could see it in her posture. She felt the shift, even if she did not know why. I walked down the steps and stopped at the edge of where the fence had been. The ground felt wrong underfoot. Looser. Disconnected. Like it had lost its anchor. You got what you wanted, I said. She turned toward me slowly. We enforced the rules, she replied. Same tone. Same certainty. But it did not land the same anymore. Not with the line gone. Not with the ditch open. I glanced at the truck again. The driver was already closing up. Quick job. In and out. No reason to linger where questions might start. Smart. But not enough. You removed a control point, I said. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. You keep using that word like it means something here. I did not answer right away. Instead, I walked past her toward the ditch and stepped down into the shallow channel. The soil compressed under my weight, damp just beneath the surface. I crouched and pressed my hand into it again. Same give. Same hold. But now there was nothing guiding where it would move next. I stood and looked back at her. It means everything here. A gust of wind moved through the open yards, pushing loose dust across the exposed line. It settled unevenly, collecting in the low spots where water would eventually follow. I could already see the path forming. Subtle. But there. Victoria followed my gaze for a second, then looked back at me. You are overthinking a fence, she said. That word again. Fence. Small. Contained. Manageable. She kept reducing it, trying to keep the problem inside a box she could control. But the box was gone. I stepped out of the ditch and brushed the dirt from my hands. No, I said. You are underestimating the ground. Another board member shifted near the curb, glancing between us like he was waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. No one did. The silence stretched. Not empty. Just full of things that had not been said yet. My phone buzzed again. This time I checked it. Updated alert. Rain expected within hours. Not heavy. But steady. Enough to test any open path. I looked up at the sky again. The clouds had thickened. Gray pushing in from the horizon, flattening the light even more. The air felt heavier. Closer. Victoria followed my eyes this time. She saw it too. Not the system. Not the line. Just the weather. "It is just rain," she said. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and met her gaze. "Not with that line open." She held my stare for a second longer, then looked away first. Small. But telling. The crew finished loading the last section of my fence onto the truck. The driver climbed in and started the engine. Gravel crunched as he pulled away, leaving the space behind him empty and quiet in a way it had not been an hour ago. Victoria watched the truck go, then turned back to me like she still had the last word. "We will be sending you the compliance invoice," she said. "And if you try to rebuild, the fines will escalate." There it was. The escalation she understood. Paper. Numbers. Pressure. I nodded once, not agreeing. Just acknowledging that she had said it out loud. Because once it was said, it was part of the record. "Send it," I said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, like she expected resistance. Then she turned and walked toward the curb, heels steady, posture intact. From a distance, it looked like control. Up close, it felt like something else. Something about to crack under weight it did not recognize. I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the open line where my fence had been. The path was clear now. Too clear. And when the first drop hit that ground, it was going to choose a direction. The only question was who would be standing in it when it did. The first drop hit the dirt near the ditch and disappeared almost instantly. It did not splash. It sank. That was how I knew the ground was ready. I stood on the porch and watched the sky settle into a low gray ceiling that pressed everything down. The air felt heavier now, like it was holding something back. Another drop followed. Then another. Slow at first. Quiet. The kind of rain people ignore until it changes shape. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the open line where my fence used to stand. The ground had already darkened in patches, small circles spreading outward and connecting. The path was forming again, but this time there was nothing to guide it. Water does not wait for permission. It finds the easiest way forward. I crouched near the edge and watched the first thin stream begin to move. It slid along the shallow channel, hesitated where the soil dipped, then shifted sideways into the nearest yard. That was new. That was not supposed to happen. I stood up and looked toward the gray house where the woman had stepped outside earlier. Her back door was open now. She stood just inside, watching the ground like she was trying to understand what she was seeing. The stream widened slightly, enough to leave a clear mark across her lawn. Not deep. Not yet. But visible. I pulled my phone out and checked the update again. Rain steady for the next 3 hours. That was more than enough. I walked back toward the driveway and looked down the line where the rest of the fence had been. Water started to gather along the exposed edge, pooling in places where the ground dipped unevenly after the removal. Each pool connected to the next, building a slow, shallow current that moved toward the lowest point. Toward the houses. I turned toward the street as a car rolled up and stopped hard near the curb. One of the board members stepped out, jacket pulled tight against the rain that was now picking up speed. He looked at the ditch, then at the water crossing the yard, and then at me. "What is happening?" he asked. His voice was not steady. I did not answer right away. Instead, I pointed toward the ground. "You open the path," I said. He followed my hand, watching the thin stream widen into something more defined. It cut across the grass now, carving a line that did not belong there. The rain picked up again, louder against the roofs and the pavement. The sound changed everything. What had been quiet was now constant. I could hear it hitting the exposed soil, pushing it loose, carrying it forward inch by inch. Victoria's car door slammed somewhere behind him. I did not turn. I did not need to. I could feel her presence before I saw it. She stepped into view, hair pulled tight, expression fixed, but there was something different now. Not control. Not fully. It is just runoff, she said. But her eyes moved quickly. Too quickly. She was tracking it now. Trying to follow what she had started. The stream reached the edge of the gray house's patio and spread out, thin at first, then wider as more water fed into it. The woman stepped back inside, closing the door slowly, like that might stop what was already outside. It would not. I stepped closer to the ditch again and watched as the main channel began to fill. It was not overflowing. Not yet. But the balance was gone. Without the fence line, without the defined edge, the water had options. And it was choosing the wrong ones. You need to stop this, the board member said, looking at me again like I had caused it. I shook my head once. I did not remove the control. The rain intensified, hitting harder now, bouncing off the ground instead of sinking cleanly. The soil near the ditch began to shift, small sections sliding into the shallow channel and changing its shape. I could see the flow adjust in real time. Subtle, but enough to redirect it further into the yards. Victoria stepped forward, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground. She looked down, then back up at me. Fix it, she said. The word came out sharper than before. Urgent. I held her gaze for a second, then glanced back at the open line. You removed what fixed it, I said. The board member turned toward her, his voice low but tight. We need to call someone. She did not respond. Not right away. She kept watching the water move, like she was trying to understand how something so small could change so quickly. The rain kept falling. Steady now. Relentless in a way that did not need force to be effective. The stream across the yard deepened just enough to leave a darker, permanent mark. Not damage. Not yet. But the beginning of it. I stepped back onto the driveway and watched the entire line from one end to the other. The path was no longer theoretical. It was visible. Active. Moving. And every inch of it traced back to where the fence had been. Victoria finally pulled her phone out, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before she tapped the screen. Too late for hesitation. The system had already started responding. And once it started, it did not stop just because someone realized they made a mistake. The rain settled into a steady sheet, not loud, just constant enough to erase any pause between drops. Water ran along the open line. Where my fence used to stand, no longer guessing where to go. It had found direction. The shallow stream across the gray house's yard widened by a few inches, then another, pushing closer to the edge of the patio. I watched the angle change. Slight. But enough. Victoria stood still for a moment, her phone pressed to her ear, listening more than speaking. That was new. She was not issuing orders now. She was waiting for answers. The board member stepped closer to the ditch, shoes sinking deeper with each step. He looked down, then back at her. It is spreading, he said. His voice carried over the rain, thinner than before. Victoria turned slightly, her back no longer fully squared toward me. A shift in stance. Small but real. We are handling it, she said into the phone. But her eyes stayed on the water. Not the call. The water. I stepped down toward the edge again, careful with each step as the ground softened under the weight of the rain. The soil near the channel had begun to move in slow, uneven slides, changing the shape of the path in real time. Every inch that shifted redirected the flow just enough to make the next inch worse. That was the part people never saw until it was already happening. I crouched and picked up a small piece of loose dirt, letting it crumble between my fingers. It broke apart easily now. Saturated. Unstable. I let it fall back into the stream and watched it get carried a few feet before settling again. The system was adjusting on its own. Without guidance. Without boundaries. That was when it became unpredictable. A car pulled up fast along the curb, tires hissing against the wet pavement. Another neighbor stepped out, this one holding a towel over his head, looking from yard to yard like he was trying to trace where the water was coming from. He did not look at me. He looked at Victoria. That told me everything. She was still the authority in his mind. For now. Why is it cutting across my yard? He asked. Victoria lowered her phone slowly, ending the call without saying goodbye. She did not answer him. Not directly. It is temporary, she said, but the word did not land. Not with the water visible. Not with the rain still falling. The stream reached the corner of his property next, thinner than the first, but connected. Always connected. I stood and stepped back, giving the flow space to show itself. It moved in lines now. Not random. Not scattered. Lines that followed the lowest points, the softest ground, the path that had been exposed. And every one of those lines traced back to the same place. The open gap. Victoria took a step toward me, her heels sinking slightly deeper this time. She did not look down anymore. She was watching me. You knew this would happen, she said. It was not a question. I met her gaze and let the silence sit for a second before answering. I knew what that line controlled. Another shift. She did not argue. Not immediately. The board member moved closer to her, lowering his voice again. We need to get someone out here now, he said. Not later. Now. Victoria nodded once, sharp and quick, then raised her phone again. This time her voice changed. Shorter. More direct. Less certain. The rain picked up again, heavier for a moment, enough to push the streams faster across the exposed ground. The water reached the edge of another patio and pooled there, spreading out in a thin, even layer. Not deep. Not dangerous. But visible in a way that could not be ignored. I walked back toward the driveway and stopped near the spot where the main gate had been dragged earlier. The gravel there had shifted, leaving a shallow depression that now filled with water, creating a small basin that fed directly into the larger flow. Another connection. Another path. I could see the pattern forming across the entire line. It was no longer isolated to one yard. It was moving. Expanding. Adjusting. Victoria ended the call and lowered the phone slowly. Her posture had changed again. Less rigid. Less certain. They are sending someone, she said, but she did not sound convinced that it would be enough. I nodded once. Not agreeing. Just acknowledging the step. Because steps mattered now. Every decision had a consequence that showed up within minutes, not days. The board member looked between us again, his earlier confidence gone completely. What do we do until they get here? He asked. I looked back at the open line, at the water moving steadily through a system that had lost its guide. Then I looked at Victoria. You wait, I said. The word landed differently this time. Not passive. Not weak. Just real. Because there was nothing left to stop it in this moment. No quick fix. No immediate correction. Just the result of what had already been set in motion. The rain continued, steady and controlled, like it had all the time it needed. And for the first time since this started, Victoria did not speak. The rain did not slow down. It settled into a steady rhythm that filled every gap in the air, turning the entire street into one continuous sound. Water kept moving along the open line, no hesitation now, no confusion. It had found its path, and it was building on it. I watched as the stream near the gray house deepened just enough to carry small pieces of mulch and loose grass with it. Tiny things. But they moved fast. Faster than they should. That was how the system accelerated. Small shifts that added up. The neighbor with the towel stepped further into his yard, his shoes already soaked, his eyes tracking the water like he was trying to solve it on the spot. He crouched near the edge where the flow crossed his lawn and reached down, pressing his hand into the stream like he could stop it. It slipped around his fingers and kept going. He stood up quickly, wiping his hand against his jeans, and looked back at Victoria. This is not normal, he said. His voice carried a different tone now. Not confusion. Not annoyance. Concern. Real concern. Victoria did not answer him right away. She was watching the ditch again, her focus narrowing as the main channel began to shift shape under the steady rain. The edges softened, widening in places where the soil gave way, tightening in others where debris collected and redirected the flow. It was no longer a fixed line. It was changing minute by minute. That was the part people never prepared for. I stepped closer to the driveway basin and nudged a small piece of gravel into the water. It rolled once, then twice, then disappeared into the larger stream moving toward the backyards. Everything connected. Now. Every inch. Victoria noticed the movement and looked at me. "You keep watching like this is expected," she said. There was something new in her voice. Not control. Not yet panic. But the space between them. I met her eyes and kept my tone level. "It is doing exactly what it was designed to do." She frowned slightly, like the answer did not fit the situation she believed she was in. "This was not designed," she said. "This is damage." I shook my head once. "No. This is what happens when you remove what guides it." The board member stepped back from the ditch, his shoes now coated in wet soil, his earlier confidence completely gone. He looked down the line, following the flow as it moved across multiple yards now, connecting them in a way none of them had seen before. "It is reaching everyone," he said quietly. That was the moment the scope became clear. Not just 1 yard. Not just one mistake. The entire back line of the subdivision was now part of the same system. Open. Active. Exposed. A low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance, soft but enough to change the air again. The rain responded, not heavier, but more persistent. Like it had settled in for longer than expected. I glanced at the sky, then back at the ground. Timing. Always timing. Victoria followed my gaze again, then looked back at the water. She took a step closer to the ditch, her shoes sinking deeper this time, forcing her to adjust her balance. That small shift said more than anything she had spoken so far. She was feeling it now. The loss of control. "How far does this go?" she asked. Not to the board. Not to the neighbors. To me. I let the question sit for a second, listening to the rain, watching the flow continue to build. "Far enough," I said. Not an answer she wanted. But the only one that mattered. The neighbor near the gray house stepped back again as the water spread wider across his yard, reaching the edge of a small garden bed and pooling there before spilling over into the next section. He looked at Victoria again, waiting for direction. She did not have any. Not for this. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at it, then back up, like whatever was on the screen did not solve what was in front of her. Another car pulled up along the curb, slower this time. A county truck. White. Marked. It rolled to a stop and idled for a second before the driver stepped out, pulling a cap low against the rain. He looked at the open line, then at the water moving through the yards, and his expression shifted almost immediately. Recognition. Not confusion. Not surprise. He had seen this before. He walked toward the ditch without speaking, crouched near the edge, and pressed his hand into the soil just like I had earlier. Then he stood and looked directly at Victoria. "Who authorized the removal?" he asked. No accusation in his voice. Just a question that carried weight. Victoria hesitated. Just long enough to be noticed. Then she straightened slightly, trying to regain something she had already lost. "We enforce community guidelines," she said. The man did not react. Not right away. He looked back at the water, then down the line, tracing the flow across the properties. "You removed a control boundary," he said. Simple. Direct. Final. The words landed heavier than anything I had said. Because now they were not coming from me. They were coming from the system she had stepped into without understanding it. Victoria's posture shifted again, just slightly, but enough to show the crack. And the rain kept falling. The county officer did not rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He stood there in the rain, looking at the water move like he had already seen the outcome before it finished happening. Then he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and walked the line where my fence used to be. His boots pressed into the softened ground, leaving deep marks that filled with water almost immediately. He stopped halfway and looked down at one of the disturbed survey points, the orange cap now tilted just enough to matter. He did not touch it. He did not need to. This was set for a reason, he said, more to the ground than to anyone else. Victoria shifted her weight, arms crossing again, but it did not look the same anymore. It looked like she was holding something in place. We had multiple complaints about the structure, she said. Her voice was steady, but thinner now. The officer nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she had spoken. Then he looked at the water again as it pushed across another yard, connecting two low points that had never been connected before. Complaints do not override function, he said. Simple. Flat. Final. The board member beside her looked away, his focus dropping to the ground like he did not want to be part of that sentence. The rain continued, steady and consistent, filling every space that had been opened. The stream near the driveway basin grew slightly deeper, enough to carry small stones now. I watched one roll along the edge, catching for a second before slipping into the main flow. The system was stabilizing in its own way. Not correcting. Just adapting. The officer walked closer to the ditch and crouched again, this time longer, his hand pressing deeper into the soil, feeling the saturation beneath the surface. When he stood, his expression had shifted. Not surprised. Not confused. Confirmed. How long ago was the boundary removed? He asked. Victoria hesitated again. Just long enough for the rain to fill the silence. About an hour, she said. The officer glanced at me for the first time, then back at her. And no temporary control put in place? She did not answer. The silence answered for her. Another small shift. Another piece falling into place. The neighbor with the towel stepped closer, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by something more direct. This is spreading into 3 yards now, he said. What are we supposed to do? The question hung there, heavier than the rain. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. No answer. Not one that worked here. The officer stepped up onto the driveway and wiped his hands against his pants, leaving dark streaks that blended into the wet fabric. You are going to need immediate mitigation, he said. This line was controlling distribution. Without it, the flow will continue to redirect. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every word landed clearly. Victoria nodded once, quick, like agreement might fix something already in motion. We called for assistance, she said. They are on the way. The officer looked down the line again, following the water as it moved through each yard, tracing the same path I had watched form earlier. They need to move fast, he said, because this is already past initial deviation. That phrase settled in the air. Initial deviation. Not damage. Not failure. A shift in system behavior. Controlled language for something that was becoming very visible. I leaned against the porch rail and watched as another section of soil near the ditch gave way, just slightly, changing the angle of the main channel again. The water responded immediately, pushing further into the open space, widening the path across the backyards. Every adjustment made the next one easier. Victoria followed the movement, her focus locked now, her earlier certainty gone. Can it be contained? She asked. This time, she did not look at me. She looked at the officer. He paused for a moment, considering the ground, the flow, the timing. Then he answered. Not without restoring the control point. Direct. No extra words. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the open line, toward the space where my fence had been. The realization hit, but she did not say it out loud. She did not need to. It was written across the ground in front of her. The board member shifted again, stepping back from the edge as the water reached another low point near his shoes. He looked at Victoria, waiting. Still waiting. That was the part that had not changed. They still expected her to fix it. But this was not something she could fix with a notice or a fine. This was tied to something larger. Something already moving. The officer pulled out his radio and spoke into it, his voice low and steady, calling in the situation with words that carried weight beyond the neighborhood. I could not hear every detail, but I did not need to. The tone said enough. This was no longer local. Victoria stood still, her phone in her hand, her posture caught between control and uncertainty. The rain kept falling, steady and consistent, feeding the system she had disrupted. And the line she had removed was now the only thing that could stop what came next. The county officer lowered the radio and the air shifted again, not because the rain changed, but because the response had. This was no longer a situation being observed. It was being recorded. I watched as he walked the line a second time, slower now, stopping at each point where the ground had shifted. He was not guessing. He was documenting. Each step mattered. Each mark in the soil told a story that did not need explanation. Victoria stood a few feet away, her posture held together by habit more than certainty. She followed him with her eyes, not interrupting this time. That was new. Silence from her meant she was listening, even if she did not want to admit it. The water continued to move, steady and confident now, carving clearer paths through the yards. The shallow stream near the gray house had widened enough to leave a defined channel in the grass, not deep, but permanent in the way it cut through the surface. The neighbor stood at his back door again, watching it form, his arms crossed tight against his chest. He was no longer confused. He was tracking the damage before it arrived. The officer stopped near the center of the line and looked up at Victoria. "This is going to extend beyond private property if it continues," he said. No urgency in his voice. Just fact. That was the difference between panic and authority. Victoria nodded once, slower this time. "We are addressing it," she said. The words came out softer, like she was trying them on instead of owning them. The officer did not respond. He turned and looked down the line again, following the water as it connected yard after yard. The pattern was clear now. Not random. Not temporary. Structured in its own way. I stepped off the porch and moved closer, stopping just short of the open boundary. The rain soaked through my jacket, but I barely noticed it. My focus stayed on the line. On the system adjusting itself without the control it had relied on. Victoria glanced at me, then back at the officer. "What happens if we restore it now?" she asked. That question mattered. It was the first time she acknowledged what had been removed as something necessary. The officer took a second before answering, his eyes still on the ground. "You slow it down," he said. "You do not stop what has already started." Another shift. Another piece falling into place. The board member stepped closer, his voice tight. "So we fix it and it just keeps going?" The officer looked at him briefly. "You reduce impact. You do not erase it." The words landed heavier than anything before. Because now the outcome had a timeline. Not immediate. Not reversible. Just manageable if handled correctly. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just enough to show the weight she was carrying now. She looked at the open line again, at the space where my fence had been, and for the first time, she did not call it a violation. She did not call it anything. She just looked at it. The rain continued, steady and controlled, feeding the system that had already adapted. Another county truck pulled up behind the first, followed by a smaller vehicle with equipment in the back. Doors opened. Boots hit the wet pavement. Voices stayed low. Focused. This was no longer a conversation. It was a response. The officer waved them over and pointed along the line, explaining in short, direct phrases. They nodded, already moving, already assessing. One of them stepped into the ditch and measured the depth with a tool, then looked back at the others with a quick shake of his head. Not good. Not yet critical. But trending that way. I watched Victoria as she took a step back, giving them space. Not leading anymore. Not directing. Just present. That was the clearest sign of all. She had lost control of the situation. And she knew it. The neighbor near the gray house moved along the edge of his yard, following the water as it pushed closer to the base of his patio. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He just watched, like he was memorizing the line it was drawing. Because once it was there, it would not fully disappear. Not without effort. Not without cost. The officer turned back toward Victoria one more time. "You will need to document the removal and the response," he said. "Everything from the moment it was altered." Victoria nodded again, slower now. "We will," she said. But her voice lacked the confidence it carried before. Because documentation meant accountability. And accountability meant this did not end here. I stepped back onto the driveway and looked down the full length of the open line, now marked by water, movement, and attention from people who understood what it meant. The rain kept falling, steady and patient, like it had all the time in the world to show exactly what had been changed. And standing there, watching the system respond, I knew this was no longer about a fence, or a rule, or even a single decision. It was about everything that decision had touched, and everything that was still coming because of it. The additional crew moved quickly but not carelessly, spreading out along the exposed line like they were mapping something invisible. One of them unrolled a length of bright orange barrier fabric and drove short stakes into the softened ground, creating a temporary edge where my fence had been. It was not enough to stop the flow, but it gave the water something to recognize. A hint of direction. I watched as the current responded almost immediately, slowing in some places, tightening in others, adjusting to the new resistance. Not fixed, but guided. That was the difference. The county officer stood near the center of the line, arms crossed now, tracking each adjustment as it happened. He was not surprised. Just measuring the outcome against what he expected. Victoria stayed back near the curb, her distance from the work now noticeable. She did not step in. She did not give instructions. She watched, her phone still in her hand but unused. The board member hovered beside her, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet urgency that had nowhere to go. "Is that going to hold?" he asked, nodding toward the temporary barrier. The officer did not answer right away. He waited, watching the water settle into the new edge. "It will slow distribution," he said finally. "It buys time. Time. Not a solution. Not a fix. Just space to respond." Another worker stepped into the ditch with a shovel, clearing a small blockage where debris had collected and narrowed the channel. The water shifted again, pulling back from one yard and pushing harder into another before stabilizing. Every movement mattered. Now, every inch changed something further down the line. I stepped closer to the edge, watching the way the current reacted to each adjustment. The system was still active, still adapting, but now it had resistance. Structure. Even temporary structure made a difference. Victoria took a step forward then stopped, her shoes sinking slightly before she caught herself. She looked down, then back at the line. "We need this restored," she said. The words came out quieter, more measured. Not a command. A realization. I did not respond. I did not need to. The crew already understood. They were working toward that point, even if it would take time to get there. One of them carried over a section of temporary paneling and set it along the staked fabric, reinforcing the edge in the most vulnerable spot near the gray house. The water hit it, hesitated, then redirected back toward the main channel. Not perfectly, but enough to prevent it from spreading further. The neighbor watched from his doorway, his posture easing slightly as the flow shifted away from his patio. Not gone, but reduced. That was all anyone could ask for right now. The rain continued, steady and patient, feeding the system that was slowly being guided back into place. Another county worker approached the officer with a clipboard, handing it over with a few quiet words. The officer scanned it briefly, then nodded. He turned toward Victoria again. "We will need full documentation," he said. "Removal, timing, response, and any prior notices." His tone did not change. It did not need to. The weight was already there. Victoria nodded, slower now, her eyes moving between the crew and the ground. "You will have it," she said. But her voice carried something new. Not confidence. Not control. Responsibility. The board member looked at her, then at the officer, like he was seeing the structure of authority shift in real time. The rain softened slightly, just enough to reduce the intensity of the flow, but not enough to stop it. The water still moved along the line, still connected, still active. I walked back toward the driveway basin and watched as it filled and drained in a steady cycle, no longer spilling outward as aggressively as before. The temporary edge was doing its job. For now. The officer stepped closer to me, stopping just short of the boundary. "You understood this line," he said. Not a question. I nodded once. "I built around it." He held my gaze for a second, then looked back at the work being done. "It will take time to restore," he said. "And it will not be exactly the same." I glanced at the open space where my fence had been, now partially lined with temporary structure and moving water. "It never is," I said. He nodded once, then stepped away, returning to the crew. Victoria watched that exchange, her expression unreadable for a moment, then shifting into something more grounded. Less certain. More aware. The rain continued, steady and controlled, as the temporary line held against the flow, buying time for something more permanent to come. And as I stood there, watching the system slowly regain shape, I knew the next step would not be about water or soil or timing. It would be about everything that had led to this moment, and everything that would follow once the ground settled. The temporary barrier held, but it did not hide what had already changed. The water still moved along the line, quieter now, more controlled, but it carried a memory of where it had gone. That was the part people missed. The ground remembers. I stood near the driveway and watched as the crew adjusted the panels, tightening the gaps, reinforcing the weakest points where the flow had tried to push through earlier. Each adjustment slowed something. Each delay mattered. But nothing erased the path that had already formed. The county officer walked the line again, slower this time, stopping to speak with each worker, pointing out spots where the soil had shifted more than expected. He was not reacting anymore. He was mapping the aftermath. Victoria stayed near the curb, her arms no longer crossed, her posture looser but heavier, like she was carrying the weight of something she could not set down. The board member stood beside her, silent now, his earlier questions replaced by quiet observation. That shift told me everything. They were no longer trying to control the situation. They were trying to understand it. A third truck pulled up, this one carrying longer sections of reinforced paneling and additional stakes. The crew moved to unload it without hesitation, working in a rhythm that came from experience, not urgency. They knew what needed to be done. They also knew it would not be quick. I stepped closer to the line and watched as they began placing the heavier panels along the most active sections, anchoring them deeper into the ground. The water responded again, tightening its flow back toward the main channel, pulling away from the outer yards inch by inch. Not gone, but retreating. That was progress. The neighbor near the gray house stepped out onto his patio again, this time without the phone, his attention fixed on the edge where the water had been earlier. He watched as it pulled back slightly, leaving behind a darker strip in the grass that marked where it had passed. He did not speak. He just nodded once, like he understood something now that he had not before. The rain softened further, the steady sheet breaking into a lighter pattern that tapped against the roofs and pavement instead of pressing down. The change was subtle, but it eased the pressure on the system. The officer noticed it too. He looked up briefly, then back at the line, recalculating without saying a word. Victoria stepped forward again, careful with her footing, stopping just short of the reinforced section near the ditch. She looked at the panels, then at the water, then at the ground beyond them. "How long before it stabilizes?" she asked. Her voice was different now. Not demanding. Not certain. Just direct. The officer took a moment before answering, watching the flow settle into the new structure. "Hours for this," he said, nodding toward the immediate line. "Days for the ground." Another piece of the timeline. Not instant. Not reversible. Just something that had to be managed over time. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing it. The board member finally spoke again, his voice low. And after that? The officer looked at him, then back at the open space where my fence had been. You rebuild the control, he said. Properly. That word carried. Wait. Not quickly. Not partially. Correctly. I felt Victoria's gaze shift toward me, but I did not turn right away. I kept watching the line, the way the water now followed the reinforced edge, the way the system began to settle into something closer to what it had been before. Not the same, but closer. When I finally looked at her, her expression had changed again. Less resistance. More recognition. We will need to coordinate that, she said. Not a statement of authority. A request for structure. I nodded once. Not agreeing yet. Just acknowledging the direction. Because coordination meant rules. And rules meant this would not be handled the way it started. The officer stepped back toward his truck, speaking briefly into his radio again, updating whoever was on the other end. His tone stayed steady. Controlled. Like the situation itself was finally moving in that direction. The rain continued to ease, the flow along the lines slowing as the temporary and reinforced barriers did their job. The yards behind the line began to separate again, the connections breaking as the water returned to the channel it had been designed to follow. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to see the shape of it. I stepped back onto the porch and rested my hand on the railing, feeling the damp wood under my palm. The air smelled different now. Less sharp. More grounded. Like the system had taken a breath. Victoria turned slightly, looking down the full length of the line, then back toward the street, then finally toward me again. She did not speak. Not this time. Because whatever came next was not something she could decide alone anymore. The rain eased into a light, steady mist, the kind that no longer forced the ground to react but still reminded it of what had just happened. The temporary and reinforced barriers held their shape now, guiding the water back into the channel it was always meant to follow. The movement across the yard slowed, then separated, each line pulling back toward the ditch like a system remembering its original design. I stood on the porch and watched the last of the surface flow retreat from the gray house's lawn, leaving behind a dark trace that cut across the grass like a signature. It was not damage in the way people expected. It was evidence. The crew moved with less urgency now, adjusting the panels one final time, pressing them deeper into the ground, checking each connection point like they were sealing something that could not be left open again. The county officer walked the line one more time, slower than before, his steps deliberate, his attention fixed on the details that remained after the motion had settled. He stopped near the center and looked down at the soil, then up at the homes behind it. This will need a full rebuild, he said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for it to be heard. Victoria stood a few feet back, her posture no longer rigid, her arms resting at her sides instead of crossed in front of her. She listened without interrupting. That was the clearest change of all. We will coordinate it, she said after a moment. Her voice was steady, but it carried none of the authority it had earlier. It carried responsibility now. The board member beside her nodded, though it felt more like agreement than confidence. They both looked toward the line, not as something to control, but as something they had to respect. One of the workers approached the officer and handed him a tablet, pointing out the sections they had reinforced and the areas that still needed attention. The officer reviewed it briefly, then added notes, with a few quick movements. No wasted motion. No hesitation. This was the part that followed every disruption. Documentation. Structure. Accountability. I stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the line, stopping at the edge where the temporary barrier met the reinforced panels. The ground felt firmer now, the water no longer shifting it with every movement. I looked down at the ditch, where the flow had settled into a steady, controlled stream again. Not as clean as before. Not as precise. But contained. That was enough for now. Victoria stepped closer, careful with each step, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. She did not look at the water first. She looked at the space where the fence had been. The absence was still there, clear and defined. We will need to restore this exactly, she said. It was not a question. It was an understanding. I turned slightly toward her, keeping my eyes on the line. Not exactly, I said. Correctly. She held that for a second, then nodded once. No argument. No correction. Just acceptance. The officer walked back toward us, his boots leaving lighter impressions now that the ground had begun to stabilize. He glanced at the two of us, then at the line between us. There will be a report, he said, and follow-up inspections. Victoria nodded again. Understood. The board members shifted slightly behind her, looking down at the ground, then back toward the houses, as if measuring the distance between what had happened and what would come next. The rain faded further, the mist thinning until it was barely noticeable. The air felt clearer, but heavier in a different way. Not from weather. From consequence. The crew began packing up the extra equipment, leaving the reinforced sections in place, marking them with bright flags that stood out against the darkened ground. Temporary but visible. A reminder. I walked back toward the porch and stopped halfway, turning to look down the full length of the line one more time. The yards were separate again. The flow was contained. The system had responded, adapted, and settled. But the mark remained. It always would. Victoria stood near the curb now, speaking quietly with the officer, her tone measured, her posture steady but no longer dominant. She glanced toward me once, then back at him, like she understood where the line had shifted. Not just in the ground. In everything around it. I rested my hand on the porch railing again, feeling the damp wood under my palm, and let my eyes follow the path the water had taken, from the first drop to where it finally returned to the channel. It was all still there, even if the movement had stopped. And as the last of the mist lifted from the ground, one thing was clear. This was not something that would be forgotten. It was something that would be recorded, measured, and rebuilt with a level of care that had not been there before. Because once a system shows you what it controls, you do not ignore it. Again. The street was quiet by late afternoon, but the ground still told the story. The temporary barriers stood in a clean line now, reinforced and marked, guiding the last thin threads of water back into the ditch. The air had dried just enough to carry the smell of damp soil and cut wood without the sharp edge from earlier. It felt different. Not calm. Just settled. I stepped off the porch and walked the full length of the boundary, slower this time, taking in every detail the rain had left behind. The grass across the backyard showed faint lines where the water had passed, darker strips that curved and connected like a map drawn without permission. They would fade over time. But not completely. They never did. At the center point, where the survey cap had been shifted, the ground looked slightly uneven, like it had been disturbed in a way that could not be undone without effort. I crouched and pressed my hand into it again. Firmer now. But not the same. That was the cost of interruption. The system recovers. It just does not forget. Behind me, the county trucks idled for a moment longer before one by one they pulled away, leaving the reinforced line in place and the responsibility behind with the people who had to live next to it. The officer gave a final nod toward the boundary before stepping into his truck. No speech. No warning. Everything that needed to be said had already been said on the ground. Victoria stood near the curb as the last vehicle left, her posture steady but quieter, like she was holding on to something she had only just begun to understand. The board member beside her shifted his weight, glancing down the line one more time before speaking. "We will need a full review," he said. Victoria nodded once. No hesitation this time. "We will," she replied. The words came out grounded. Not defensive. Not distant. Just real. I continued along the line until I reached the far end, where the ground sloped gently back into the natural channel. The water there moved cleanly again, contained within the space it had always followed. No spread. No confusion. Just flow. That contrast said everything. I turned back and walked toward the porch, passing the open gap where my fence had been. It no longer felt empty. It felt defined in a different way. Temporary panels stood where wood and steel once had, but the function was back. The control was visible again, even if the form had changed. Victoria approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, careful with her footing even now. She looked at the panels, then at me. "We will restore it," she said. "With proper oversight." I met her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the line. "You will restore what it does," I said. "Not just how it looks." She held that, then nodded. No argument. No correction. Just acceptance. The board member stepped closer, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something more measured. "We will coordinate with the county," he added. "And with you." That last part mattered. Not because of authority. Because of alignment. I nodded once. Not as approval. As acknowledgement of the shift. The sun began to break through the thinning clouds, casting a low light across the damp ground. It caught the edge of the temporary panels and reflected off the shallow water still moving through the ditch. The line was visible again. Clear. Defined. Respected. I stepped back onto the porch and rested my hand on the railing, looking out over the yards that had just hours ago been connected in a way they were never meant to be. Now they were separate again. Individual. Protected by something most of them had never noticed before. Victoria turned to leave, pausing once at the curb to look back at the boundary. Not at me. At the line. That was the difference. She saw it now. Not as an obstacle. Not as a violation. As a system. The board member followed her, both of them quieter than when they had arrived, their steps slower, more deliberate. The street remained still as they walked away, the only sound the steady movement of water returning to its path. I stayed there a moment longer, letting the scene settle fully into place. The line had been broken. Then it had shown exactly why it existed. And now it stood again, not just as a fence to be rebuilt, but as a boundary that had proven itself. I looked down the length of it one last time, from one end to the other, and let the quiet carry what did not need to be said. Because some lines are not there to be questioned. They are there to hold everything together.